Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Brookings. I'm Mike O'Hanlon with the Foreign Policy Program. We have a special treat today, although on a very difficult subject. We're talking about South Sudan, one of the most conflict-torn and fragile countries in the world, also one of the newest countries in the world, and there had been great hope that its independence and its self-determination would lead to a period of peace, and that has not happened. We're going to learn a lot about the course of recent events over the last decade or so, but specifically the last 5 years in today's discussion, and then look forward to what policy options still are available to the international community as we wrestle with the possibility of an even worsening situation in South Sudan today. The way we'll proceed, we're really fortunate and thrilled to have Hilde Johnson with us today. She's just completed a book that you're all invited to consider purchasing, and it's available in the back of the room, and you can do that at any point during the next hour and a half. It's called South Sudan, The Untold Story, From Independence to Civil War. So it's not a happy read, but it covers most of the decade, really the whole half decade, I should say, since 2011 and independence, primarily the 3 years when Special Representative Johnson was the UN Special Representative in South Sudan, living there, working there from independence through the summer of 2014. But there is also an epilogue, and a lot of the narrative carries us into the future and the debates that we need to have going forward as well. So the way we'll proceed is that she will begin with, even though we have an informal conversation set up here physically, she'll begin with a bit of a presentation, which summarizes some of the story of the independence of South Sudan. Many of you know there was a comprehensive peace agreement, peace accord, a CPA, that was devised with her help and others in 2005, and that gave South Sudan the option of independence, which it ultimately did exercise as of 2011 after a 6-year interim period. She wrote an earlier book about some of that time, but now we're really focused on the last 5 years. And so she's going to tell that story, perhaps also signaling a little bit about future options for the international community. But we'll also save that topic for the second half of our discussion a little bit. And I'll come back to that as moderator, at which point after her presentation I'll introduce Princeton Lyman, who obviously is one of our nation's great Africanists and who was also the United States Special Representative for South Sudan during much of this crucial period, and Brian Adeba, who is South Sudanese by origin, Canadian by citizenship, Washingtonian by current residence with the Enough Project, and who will also contribute enormously to the conversation, as will you, because after 45 to 55 minutes or so, we will then go to the audience for comments and especially your questions for the panelists. So let me just say a brief additional word about Hilde Johnson, and then we'll go right to her presentation. Again, she was, in her career, a deputy administrator for UNICEF. She was the Norwegian Minister of International Development during the period of time when these accords were fashioned. And then, as I mentioned, she was the Special Representative for the Secretary General of the United Nations in South Sudan for its first 3 years of independence. And so given that a remarkable trajectory and set of accomplishments, please join me in welcoming her to Washington and to Brookings today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is this working? Yes, it is. I'll start with a quote. On 9 July 2011, Salva Kiir Mayardit, the president of South Sudan, said the following: "Our detractors have already written us off, even before the proclamation of our independence. They say we will slip into civil war as soon as our flag is hoisted. They justify that by arguing that we are incapable of resolving our problems through dialogue. They charge that we are quick to revert to violence. They claim that our concept of democracy and freedom is faulty. It is incumbent upon us to prove them all wrong." End quote. 2 years later, the detractors were proven right. Competition for political power had turned violent and would eventually shake the foundations of the new country. Before its 3rd birthday, the dream of independence and freedom had turned into a nightmare. The liberators risked destroying the very country they had spent decades fighting for. How could this happen? In this book, which is called, as the title, South Sudan, The Untold Story from Independence to Civil War. I'm trying to answer this question. How could this happen? As Minister of International Development of Norway, I was deeply involved in the CPA negotiations that completed the peace agreement by 2005. As I think most of you know, between the government of Sudan and the Sudan People's Liberation Movement and Army, the SPLMA. After almost 5 decades, Africa's longest civil war at the time ended. And the CPA did not grant the Southerners independence, as many are thinking now, but self-determination. The parties were given unity a chance over an interim period of 6 years, after which Southern Sudan would have the right to hold a referendum on its own future. So with the CPA then, Southern Sudan had to go through at least 3 transitions, each extremely demanding. Firstly, transition from war to peace. For people who had known little but war, was a major shift. Secondly, transition from liberation struggle to government was another challenging one. Third was the complex transition to independence. And all 3 transitions were still underway after South Sudan voted overwhelmingly for independence in January 2011, and later on Independence Day, when I took the helm as SRSG and head of mission of UNMISS. I'll run through those 3 transitions quickly, and then at the end I'll talk about a few of the options. First, transition from war to peace. South Sudan was separated from Sudan in 2011 before all the terms of the divorce, quote unquote, had been reached. Relations between the neighbors were expected to be difficult, but few of us foretold bombing raids hitting refugee camps, occupation of oil fields, and a complete shutdown of oil production in South Sudan. This in turn affected all efforts of state building and peace building. At the same time, South Sudan had major internal security problems. The country's largest state, Jonglei, was mired in a cycle of intercommunal violence in which thousands of civilians had been killed. Jonglei was also a microcosm testing the country's leadership and us in the United Nations. It was here we would face our greatest challenge prior to the December 2013 crisis and the civil war. But these problems were minor compared to what would come later. So the second transition, from liberation struggle to government, was predictably very difficult. The country was awash with weapons, mostly in civilian hands. Lack of commitment prevented necessary reform. This implied turning the liberation movement into a political party, for one, and the liberation force into a national army, two. Both processes stalled. The security sector was not reformed and contained tens of thousands of former militia, which were poorly integrated into the army. Command and control was poor, corruption rampant, and inflation in rank a major problem. The SPLA itself had 700 generals, the highest per capita in the world, I believe. Furthermore, the liberators failed to use the interim CPA period to strengthen the foundations on which the country could be built through stronger institutions. They also ignored numerous warnings against corruption and mismanagement. This liberation curse took hold where people felt entitled to power. It was their turn to eat. South Sudan was soon afflicted by the oil curse. So 2 curses, liberation curse and oil curse. Oil revenue became an irresistible temptation for cadres who had spent most of their lives in the bush. Resources lubricated patronage networks, while significant amounts were simply siphoned away to foreign bank accounts. And you will find a lot of detail on these corruption scandals in the book. Instead, and for the first time, by the way. Instead of cleaning up, at the very least at independence, the liberators continued to eat and institutions remained weak. I had many discussions with Princeton about this when we were in Juba. The third transition, the complex transition to independence, was therefore marked by continuity and very limited change. The people who expected to finally reap the fruits of peace and freedom saw their hopes dashed. They continued to wait for schools for their children, clinics for their sick, and roads to get to the markets. South Sudan ended up being, by far, the biggest spender of public funds in the region. Per capita, 3 times as much as Kenya and 4 times as much as Uganda. However, South Sudan spent 1/4 of their neighbors on education, 1/5 or 6 on health. It was more likely, and is still, that a teenage girl dies in childbirth than she will enter grade 8 at school. The money went elsewhere. It was ruled by the elite for the elite. Although attempts were made by the president to address the cancer of corruption in 2012, and we did try on our side to assist in that particular process, 5 steps against corruption, etc., they were not followed through. The liberation curse and the oil curse prevailed. This also implied that state institutions, including the army, were insufficiently developed to sustain the pressure of an escalating political crisis. So the institutions were weak. Then a few words about the crisis. The build-up to it started in the fall of 2012, and early attempts were made within the SPLM to engage the 2 leaders, Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, to avoid a leadership struggle. Did not succeed. Later, in early 2013, a committee was formed, chaired by Deng Law, now the current foreign minister. And through a series of meetings amongst the cadres, they tried to resolve the leadership crisis internally. These efforts also came to a dead end. From July 2013 onwards, regional leaders flew in to help the Ethiopian foreign minister, the Kenyans, former President Thabo Mbeki and the AUHIP, South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC, they came in as well. Also other friends, discreetly, unnamed, engaged. We all did. That violence could occur was clear to many of us, but high-risk behavior from a number of leaders made everything worse. This included 3 key actions. Firstly, the total exclusion of factions of the SPLM from the new cabinet, followed by political mobilization with public confrontation on both sides. Very dangerous. Secondly, actions and moves that could be interpreted as military preparation on both sides, including movement of additional security forces to the capital outside the SPLA's normal structures. Also very risky. Thirdly, and not least, spinning of stories about arrests and disarmament in the last week before the important National Liberation Council. This was in December. In the end, Juba was like a powder keg. These series of actions contributed to what Barry Posen calls the security dilemma. Both sides took preemptive steps for their own protection, but ended up escalating the situation, and triggered by the acts of a few reckless individuals, it spun out of control. The South Sudanese leaders played with fire and allowed a power struggle to put everything they had fought for at risk. They all ignored the warnings, both from my side and other international and national stakeholders, that this would lead to ethnic violence. The last trigger was Salva Kiir's speech at the National Liberation Council. The speed, scale, and gravity of the December 2013 violence shocked everyone, including the South Sudanese leaders themselves. The massive killings and massacres of the Nuer on ethnic grounds in Juba triggered a response in kind. A shadowy group of people on the government side from the Dinka community of Baradazal had conducted the military operations, systematically killing along ethnic lines. The wholesale revenge came as a groundswell from below, making it possible for Riek Machar to mount sizable opposition forces in record time. With the SPLA splitting along ethnic lines, joined by the White Army, the opposition quickly reached numbers. These forces committed atrocities in equal measure. In other words, this was not a long-term plan. It was not a planned coup, and it was not a planned genocide. No one really planned for a civil war either. But the responsibility for the civil war, its escalation, and the current mess we're in rests with the 2 leaders, Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. They had the opportunity to stop this senseless war a long time ago. They chose not to. And they chose not to. And then the obvious question comes, what about the UN? Could we have done more? I'm sure the international community, and myself included, could have done more. We all think about this when we reflect on what has happened. Still, as early as 18 months before the crisis, I tried to organize retreats within the leadership to address both critical reform issues in the country, among the leadership, and the tensions in the leadership. All 5 of the top leaders of the SPLMA agreed at least 4 times to meet, last in February 2013, in the middle of the crisis. In the end, it never happened. So, a leadership problem. Through numerous discussions with the chairman of the SPLM committee, Dengelo, I pushed for regional leaders to be brought in earlier to help resolve the crisis, already from March 2013 onwards. However, they still wanted to resolve the crisis by themselves, and he asked me to wait. When the regional leaders finally came in, it was probably too late. Now, could the UN have done more to stop the killings and massacres in Juba? Also an important question. During the last week of December, we had 150 soldiers that were not occupied protecting our 2 major bases. Our infantry battalions were elsewhere, in Jonglei in particular, where civilians were seen to be most at risk, and we were expecting revenge attacks around this time, and the Security Council was expecting us to be present and protect. So our capacity to protect in Juba was very, very limited. So in the morning hours of 16 December, hundreds of civilians were gathering outside our gates, seeking protection from the violence that was firing off through many parts of the town. And then thousands came. They had been running for their lives. And at 7:30 a.m. in the morning of 16 December, I told our security to open the gates to our 2 bases in Juba to protect the civilians. And after this, as probably many of you know, thousands and thousands sought shelter within the UN base. I think during the first day it was 14,000 people at a scale never seen before in the UN's history. Anyone fleeing the violence, whether Nuer, Dinka or foreigners, all got refuge. And this repeated itself as the fighting continued throughout 3 of the states of the country. The number reached 140,000 during my time and has since reached 200,000. It was an absolute last resort and a decision fraught with problems. People are really suffering under very tough conditions. There's nothing that I would, think that is an optimal solution for anyone. However, their lives were saved. The increased tensions between the government and the UN was then a fact. And this led to a lot of challenges. But it was much worse for the people. The outrageous atrocities committed on both sides in equal measure are an abomination. Mass killings on ethnic grounds, the systematic use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, women and girls being gang raped and burnt alive in their dwellings, horrific crimes committed against children, not only child abduction, but castration, rape, murder. Acts of grave violence seem to be motivated as a generational attack on another ethnic group. This has never happened in South Sudan before. The atrocities committed were beyond comprehension, and the intransigence of the leaders appalling. It was as if people no longer mattered. After 18 months of negotiations by IGAD, the South Sudanese leaders finally signed a peace agreement in August 2015, with Riek Machar returning only in April 2016 to establish the transitional government. And the fundamental question we all have asked ourselves is this: can the same characters that caused the crisis now save South Sudan? We got a preliminary answer in July. South Sudan had just cancelled its independence celebrations, and I have to say, for good reason. After only 10 weeks of joint government, fighting erupted in Juba, and hundreds, if not 1,000 or more, were killed. Targeted killings took place again, and Machar fled the capital. He was pursued by government security forces for weeks. South Sudan was once again plunged into the abyss. And now I'm getting to the way forward. The country was already imploding from within. The social fabric was tearing apart. Human suffering now reached unprecedented levels. Starvation and hunger, forced displacement and violence, conflicts all over the country. the blocking of humanitarian aid and protection forces, rule by the gun with predatory behavior against innocent civilians by almost all security forces, and the list is longer. All of this committed by South Sudanese against South Sudanese. Half the population of South Sudan, 6.1 million, are now in need of aid. 2.6 million have fled their homes. It's the worst humanitarian crisis after Syria. The betrayal committed by the liberators against themselves and their people is unprecedented in this history of the country. I think the freedom fighters and the martyrs would have turned in their graves. In another ironic twist, Taban Dengai, from a faction of the opposition, was then appointed first vice president, and the fate of the peace agreement was in question. At the same time, the security decided to send a regional protection force of 4,000 soldiers to the capital and called for the establishment of the hybrid court. South Sudan urgently needs not only to be saved from fighting, it needs to be saved from failing and from falling apart. This was my assessment when the book went to print in April 2016 and I wrote the epilogue. Now it is even more urgent. The country is in a downward spiral with increased ethnic violence and an unknown development. It is not long before developments in South Sudan will become irreversible. A rescue operation is urgently needed. How? The peace agreement is the only game in town. Or is it? It now has to be rescued and revitalized. It must be used as a basis for change. And to rescue it, three things are critical. Firstly, the actual and potential spoilers of peace must be stopped. This implies that all signatories of the peace agreement must be part of the solution. Exclusion of any of them creates more spoilers, worse spoilers, and increased fighting. Number two, the peace agreement will have to be adjusted. Both the security arrangements and the power sharing arrangements would need to be reviewed. Number three, some kind of inclusive political process with a round table of all the political forces of South Sudan should be convened, paving the way for a caretaker government. This should probably be combined with external management of certain sectors that are in peril at the moment and that are key to save the country. This rescue operation will be needed for new leaders to take over. And as I say in the book, it is only the younger generation of South Sudanese leaders that can save South Sudan. They are ready, in fact, and they should be given the chance. The sooner, the better. And as Archbishop Desmond Tutu reminds us in the foreword of the book, and I quote, "In the midst of all the darkness, believing in this change is our hope," end quote. And thank you.
Hilde, fantastic presentation and amazing service on your part. I'm going to introduce Princeton and Brian in just a second, but I just wanted, and we'll explore after their remarks or during their remarks, and we'll explore your ideas at the end, certainly in more detail. But before we do that, recognizing that a lot of people in the room do know Sudan and South Sudan very well, I thought nonetheless maybe we could go over just a couple of basics for those who are sort of still catching up, and hopefully we'll read the book to catch up more. But could you just remind us, so we've gone over the independence trajectory in some detail. South Sudan is a relatively small country in terms of population, but relatively large in land area. Is that a fair way to say?
Yes.
10 or 12 million people? Or,
yeah.
And they're virtually all Christian? So this is not a
Mostly.
confessional conflict, as you were saying, it's an ethnic conflict. To the extent that there is that kind of a dimension, and it's largely a Dinka-Nuer. Those are the two major groups. Also correct?
Well, it's a political conflict that has turned ethnic. So it's very important that it basically is a power struggle. And it has just ethnic aspects to it, but it's basically a power struggle of taking control of the country and who holds control of the country. And then there are ethnic elements in that. And of course, ethnicity has been exploited in this power struggle.
Just two more background points, and then we'll go to Brian and Princeton for their reflections and comments. On the issue of the UN force that you alluded to, I believe it's a relatively large force by international standards, 12,000 or so, but it has fairly restrictive rules of engagement like most UN missions, right? In other words, this is not a peace enforcement force with a mandate to impose anything per se, but the regional protection force that has been proposed, would that have more robust rules of engagement if it were deployed, or would that just sort of be a reinforcement of the same kind of effort?
Well, you have a 12,000 force that is under the rules of engagement of the United Nations, which implies that it is a force with strong protection, Chapter 7 elements to it, but it does not have an intervention mandate or an enforcement mandate. To date, the only UN mission that has that is the Force Intervention Brigade of the Congo, in the northeast of Congo, the FIB. And I think there was discussions when the RPF, the Regional Protection Force, was raised as an important proposal from the region. There were discussions as to whether they would be given an interventionist or more robust mandate. If you read the Security Council resolution, that's less clear. And it has been not termed an intervention force, it's been termed a protection force. And it's going to have 3 roles, amongst them protecting strategic installations in the capital. It's more of a stabilization type mandate in many ways than an intervention mandate. So correct, it has a more robust mandate, but it does not go in the direction of an intervention force in the same way as the FIB has in Congo.
And I know we'll come back to this, and I know Brian and Princeton will want to comment on it as well, but just one last thing just to get some of these basic facts and figures on the table. Let's just say a quick word about oil. Of course, oil was a big part of the issue in the separation of the two Sudans, and as your book makes clear, part of the deal for separation was that Sudan itself would receive a $26 a barrel transit fee since it has the access to the sea that South Sudan lacks. When that was all negotiated, this was in the late 2000s when oil was $100 a barrel, $26 seemed like a modest fraction. Now it's the majority of the earnings. Could you just say another word about the oil economy and how that contributes?
Well, South Sudan, I didn't say that in my intervention, but South Sudan basically is bankrupt. I mean, it's hit rock bottom because you don't have any income anymore. At the time of when this book went to print, I calculated, and we calculated, that South Sudan was able to keep $4 a barrel, and that basically is close to nothing. At this point in time, they have a situation where they are in arrears to Sudan. For the fees and the deal that they got, as I'm saying in the book, they got a very lucrative deal, the Sudanese, on the transit fees. And of course, that it didn't have a clause of variation with the dollar fluctuations of the oil market is a big concern. That implies that Sudan is getting a huge amount. Actually, they are the ones benefiting from the production in the south, not South Sudan much. Now, the other aspect that one needs to know is that South Sudan is also borrowing against future oil reserves, and future oil production. So the country is heavily indebted. There's a discussion as to whether it's $4 or $7 billion, but it's really a huge debt, and it's basically been borrowing from the oil producers that are engaged in drilling in the country. They have borrowed or lent money to South Sudan against future oil reserves. So they are now in a situation where they've done 2 things. One is that, the other is domestic borrowing. So they've also exploited domestic borrowing significantly. Everyone knowing macroeconomic issues knows that that's a dead end. That's really not very wise. And it's a disastrous situation now for South Sudan. They're soon reaching, whether the economists will agree, I mean, they're soon reaching the level of hyperinflation. They have a certain technical kind of definition, but it's not far from it. So it's a complete crisis. So what also is happening is that, what is already a humanitarian crisis of enormous proportions is now worsened by the fact that you have 2 things going on. One is the economic virtual collapse of the country, with also the inability to pay salaries for security forces. So one thing is normal people can't get, purchase things on the market. One, they don't have cash. Two, the prices are unbearable. But three, you also have security forces that are without salaries, and the only way to survive is to attack civilians and grab from them. So you have a terrible situation for the civilians. And for the first time at least to my knowledge, in South Sudan, you see numbers of beggars in the streets of Juba. This never, ever happens. For those who are South Sudanese, it's a total, you do not beg. I mean, however bad the situation is, you never, ever beg. So it's different culturally from many other countries. Absolutely a shame. And it's really against your full, your integrity to do that. And now a lot of people in Juba are begging, and they just cannot survive. And so it's a disaster.
Thank you for that distressing but important picture to get on the table. So now I'd like to bring in Brian and Princeton in that order, and they're each going to speak for a few minutes, and then we'll have a broader discussion on where we go from here. But as I mentioned earlier, Brian Adeba is of South Sudanese origin, although I guess at that time, of course, it was the one Sudan, the southern part. Grew up in East Africa in general, ultimately made his way to our friends to the Great White North, and studied there in Waterloo, and I think worked on Canadian regulatory reform, if I'm not mistaken, and also was trained as a journalist en route to working on various aspects of East Africa's and specifically Sudan's various internal conflicts and governance challenges. And he's been doing this now with the Enough Project in Washington in the last recent times. Princeton Lyman, as I mentioned earlier, is undoubtedly one of America's great African experts and distinguished public servants. He was U.S. ambassador to both Nigeria and South Africa. He had a number of other postings in and about the region, also at the State Department on Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization issues and subjects dealing with Africa in many cases. And from 2011 to 13, therefore the first 2 years of South Sudan's independence, he was the United States Special Envoy to this troubled land. So he saw a lot of what Hilde was doing, and as she mentioned, they worked together on these issues during that period of time. So we'll look forward to hearing from both of you. Brian, over to you, please, for your perspectives. And as I mentioned, of course, you all know the Enough Project focuses on stopping genocide and mass killing, and that's certainly an ongoing concern in South Sudan, clearly.
Thank you. I'll make a few remarks about Hilde's book, and then I'll explore two themes in it that I think are critical, and hopefully we'll segue to Princeton. First of all, I want to say that this book is the most comprehensive book that has come out in recent years about happenings in South Sudan. In particular, the description of events leading up to 2013, that has been the most comprehensive description of what has happened, taking into consideration many viewpoints from different angles, and educating us. And basically for us, for some of us who keenly follow South Sudan issues, we were looking forward to reading that part on what exactly happened when the protagonist factions of the SPLM descended upon each other in December 2013. And I want to thank you for that. That being said, I want to look at one of the themes that I mentioned earlier, and this is the theme of the UN role in South Sudan. Obviously, the United Nations, the UNMISS mandate in South Sudan was broad. The challenges were great. It's just even amazing that someone would contemplate carrying out that mandate under those conditions. That being said, the UN did a lot of good work despite the challenges. However, one issue that will continue to dog it is the failure to protect civilians. As early as 2009, when I first visited South Sudan after many years, I visited a couple of towns, and I was basically trying to gauge opinion also about the role of the UN. And this was what I was told. These guys, they don't do nothing. When they hear shots, they just retreat to their barracks, hunker down and take defensive positions, and that's it. and this was 2009, and that label has stuck and it has continued. And it is, in fact, an indelible label on the role of the UN. And even as the protection force, the so-called protection force, contemplates getting into South Sudan, that is an issue that will continue to dog it. While this may seem an indictment of Hilde's role as a special representative in South Sudan, I think the issue is also beyond her scope, for it originates actually at UN headquarters here in New York. It therefore opens up the conversation at a much broader level, and I think it behooves of us to ask the following questions of the international community. Why did the UN force, the UN mission in South Sudan, have the few resources that it had? Why were member countries not keen on contributing the troops that were needed to sufficiently ensure the protection of civilians? In Hilde's book, you find that there are mobility issues. They had, South Sudan has no infrastructure, and during the rainy season, literally half of the country is submerged in water, and the only way to access regions or towns in order for the UN to do its role was by air, and the UN's role in that respect was incapacitated by lack of helicopters, for instance. So why were these things happening at the UN, and why were they allowed to continue? But perhaps lack of resources also wasn't the only issue that dogged the UN mission in South Sudan. Perhaps lack of commitment by the UN troops also to fight. We've seen that incident in Malakal where basically the troops could have done more, but they did not. And it allowed militia to enter the protection of civilian site and kill people with impunity. So if that is the scenario, perhaps is it time that the Department of Peacekeeping in New York, is it time to hold member countries of UNMISS, those who are the countries that contribute troops to UNMISS, to hold them accountable, to hold those troops accountable for their failure to protect civilians? Is it time to explore punitive measures against countries that contribute troops and that allow their troops not to engage in the role that they were supposed to, despite the robust mandate of the UNMISS mission in South Sudan? The second theme that I want to explore is the theme of corruption. We've just touched, she's touched on it a few times in her presentation. I found an interesting description of corruption in her book. She does not downplay it. In fact, she actually says that it is one of the factors that probably contributed to the conflict, because there was a lack of oversight on the behavior of the political elite in South Sudan. Particularly, though, I was intrigued by her exploration of the theme of kleptocracy in South Sudan. And one sentence caught my attention where she says that blaming the conflict on kleptocracy is simplistic, and she delves into the postulations that have been made by people like Alex DeWaal and the like. And she says that, in fact, President Kiir took decisive measures to combat corruption and launched some ambitious steps to thwart that vice. In other words, she was suggesting, actually, that there was a genuine effort or desire to combat corruption. But when you look at what has happened, the truth of the matter was that despite the public pronouncements by the president to combat corruption, there wasn't actually any desire to do that. And that was because the institutions of governance that were supposed to provide oversight on the actions of the political elite in South Sudan had actually been hijacked, and incapacitated through various means. I'll just touch on a few steps on how that has happened.
Maybe if I could just suggest we do it in like 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll
Sure,
get to it.
absolutely. First, the institutions were starved of the funds that they needed.
I'm saying all this.
Yeah, you're saying that, yes, it's deliberate. So there's conflicting legislation to govern their actions. For instance, the Anti-Corruption Commission cannot perform its role because there are two pieces of legislation that govern it, but these pieces of legislation are incompatible to each other. For instance, in the interim constitution, it says that the commission has powers to prosecute individuals, but the act that governs the day-to-day activities of the commission itself doesn't say that. So it allows the elite to get away with corruption. Thirdly, well, of course, was the appointment of cronies to head institutions so that these any malfeasance that happens, they don't actually pay any attention to it, to look away. And this is predominant in the Public Accounts Committee in the legislature, whose head, despite the democratic process that it undergoes, that occurs in the selection of the head, but that ultimately the decision to appoint the head depends on the Minister of Finance or the President. In most cases, it's the President. So these are the ways that corruption was allowed to continue unabated. So I'm reminded, of course, that I have a few minutes left, but that in a nutshell explains the debacle of corruption in South Sudan and how it actually contributed to this conflict. The state became the grand prize, which the competing factions of the SPLM all eyed with jealousy. And at a certain point, because the institutions that were supposed to provide oversight were incapacitated, the expression of these contests acquired violent terms. And in the end, of course, as happened in December 2013, the institutions were not there, and the country was plunged into the conflict that we're just talking about today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. Much appreciated. Princeton, over to you.
Thanks so much. And Hilde, thank you for the book, which is extremely important, as Brian has said. And I want to say another thing, that Hilde not only worked extraordinarily hard during this very difficult period, but at times at risk of your own safety and security. And that brings me to a quick point on UNMISS and the role of UNMISS. Because the government of South Sudan was never in favor of UNMISS, was never a supporter of UNMISS. Now it's most openly opposed to the UN role. And that's been a factor inhibiting UNMISS's capability. And it goes to the points that Brian raises. As a structure of peacekeeping, rarely, if ever, do you have a peacekeeping force that is willing to confront the host government's own military. Rarely, if ever. It's not even clear that it's in the mandate. The intervention brigade in the DRC is against the rebel group, but it's not against the government. And whether the UN is prepared or even capable of doing that, it seems to me is a larger question that needs to be addressed. And it comes up with this 4,000 additional forces that will face exactly the same dilemma. Let me turn to what the way forward, because Hilde's laid out a number of things, et cetera. As Hilde describes well in the book, you have a comprehensive peace agreement on paper. It's terrific. The timetables are ridiculous, but everything you'd want in a peace agreement is there. But the idea that the very people who tore the country apart and who have no stake in such transformation would carry it out is one of the fundamental weaknesses of the agreement. The only way that could have been done is if IGAD had built in a strong enforcement through international oversight and sanctions against the parties. It did not, and it hasn't done it to this day. It hasn't done it because the IGAD members are themselves sharply divided. Some are selling arms. So I know people in one country selling to both parties, and I'm sure a lot of others are doing it. They're enmeshed in the corruption, they're enmeshed in the financial dealings, et cetera, and their political rivalries between Sudan and Uganda, jealousies between Ethiopia and Kenya. So the net effect is, although they've threatened an arms embargo and other things a dozen times, they've never advocated it. And you can't go to the UN Security Council and pass something like an arms embargo unless the Africans are united behind it. Because if they're divided, Security Council's divided. Russia and China do not vote for sanctions and arms embargoes unless the region says we want it. And that's never happened yet in this case. So you don't even get an arms embargo on this situation. My feeling is that the only way to save this peace agreement, if one can save it at all, is to restructure it with a very strong international oversight and mandate. And that is not there now. And that means the IGAD countries, who are now hosting, what'd you say, 2.6 million refugees, have to recognize this crisis as bigger than all their individual interests that are keeping them from taking a stronger stand. Maybe that'll happen as the situation gets worse, but that's a big risk. And it would take a major diplomatic lift by the United States, by the United Nations, and the AU to bring about a change in that atmosphere. And I'm not sure that in the waning months of this administration, the waning months of Ban Ki-moon, the waning months of Madam Zuma at the AU, that there is bandwidth for this kind of initiative. But without it, I don't see this peace agreement moving forward. And Taban Deng does not command the loyalty of all those forces who are fighting the government. So to pretend that this government is a unity government capable of doing it is, I think, a mistake. Now, there's one more dilemma that I would raise, and that's the humanitarian aid situation. So over 60 aid workers have been killed trying to bring aid to the people of South Sudan. They've been killed by government supporters, they've been killed by opposition supporters, and a dozen other inhibitions and restrictions have been placed on the humanitarian aid effort. At the same time, the humanitarian effort runs close to $2 billion a year in South Sudan. As Hilde said, the second largest humanitarian. The question is, why should we continue it? Why should people die to feed a people whose government and opposition leaders are determined not to let them be fed? Now, you raise that, and of course, it's all horrific, and most humanitarian people in this business would say you can't turn away from it. But I wonder if, in a crazy way, we're not subsidizing the war. And maybe people should leave. You get 4 million or 5 million refugees. That's a terrible question to raise. In fact, I raised it once, and my editor told me not to put it in the article, because it is an awful dilemma. But the question is, if we're serious about arresting this situation, diplomatically, in terms of what a 4,000 additional force would do, in terms of pressure on the parties, and in terms of our own international efforts to try and avert major famine, whether we need a very different approach to bring this under control.
Well, that's an excellent start. I think it's time to bring you all in. I had said I was going to have another additional round of conversation up here about the path forward, but we've already heard a lot of ideas that have just come out, I think, organically in the discussion, whether it's a redefined UN mandate, different expectations of individual nations, peacekeepers, a power-sharing government that goes beyond the current leaders and somehow displaces them. A lot of the elements of what we might conceive of as a future course forward have already been mentioned. So I think I'll let you now take the conversation to the next level and maybe draw out some of this further with your questions. So why don't we take two at a time? Please wait for a microphone and identify yourself. And I prefer just one question per person if that's at all possible. But you're allowed to make a small comment, but not 4 questions per person. And let's start up here in the second row, and then after that, the gentleman in the 4th row, and then we'll have a second round.
Thank you. My name is Björn Järnud. In view of Mr. Lyman's last comment, I feel that I can go first. Otherwise, I'm ashamed of doing that. But Ms. Johnson, you said South Sudan must be saved. Could you explain that?
Could you?
You said that South Sudan must be saved. You said that on several occasions. I find that a puzzling statement, and who would save it, and why should that be so?
And let's take one more question before we have responses.
Rob Thar with SIL International. I found it interesting that Museveni wasn't mentioned, but you might want to make a comment about that. My question is, how does the complex language situation in South Sudan play into ethnic violence and the challenges that there are to try to unify groups?
Hilde, would you like to start with one or both of those questions?
Yeah, maybe just one comment to Brian, if I may, on this protection of civilians issue, if I can, and
Please.
on this thing, and then I'll be quick on the two others. I can maybe take those two first, and then language situations. I'm not sure that plays into things at this point in time. Most people in South Sudan speak Juba Arabic, and of course, ethnicity is important in terms of language use, but the hate speech has contributed. There has been, during my time in South Sudan, there was hate speech used to incentivize horrible acts, and that has happened during the course of the last year as well. To which extent that has been a major trigger is difficult to say at this point in time. So it's playing some role, but I think the facts on the ground probably are playing a more significant role. So I think ethnic identity, the revenge feelings are maybe larger drivers than instructions over radio, if I may put it that way, in a language. So, but others might have different views on that. But that's at least my assessment. It's dangerous, but it hasn't been as systematically used as was the case in Rwanda, and it's more the feeling of revenge and the feeling of being, of wanting to commit these acts because of what has happened to your own brothers. That seems to be a bigger driver. Then on the issue of who should save South Sudan and why, that it might sound a little patronage that somebody else has to save it. I mean, it can clearly only be saved by its own people and its own leaders. But the point is that at this point in time, South Sudan cannot be left to its own devices, which implies that there has to be an international action in one way or another to intervene. And the question is, what type of action, how, by whom? And what I was saying just in the introduction was that I believe that there needs to be a significant pressure mounted on them, and that this type of roundtable arrangement with external elements of external management of certain sectors. And with that, I mean financial sector, financial management. Likely security sector reform is not going to be easy to implement alone without a strong international intervention one way or the other. I think thirdly, you would need the oil sector to also have a big element of external management. And I think that is the saving operation and the rescue operation is in a way a combination of South Sudanese leaders, an inclusive process on the political side, underpinned by external management one way or the other of some key sectors that at this point in time it's going to be very hard to see function without that type of intervention. So that's what I'm alluding to. Then on just a few words on protection, just to inform people that it sounds always, and this is one of the things that happened to me when I came to South Sudan as an SRSG, because I was not a military person. And you have to really get your handle on the military issues if you're going to be an SRSG. And to my surprise, what sounds as big numbers are really minuscule in a country like South Sudan. So we had 7,000 soldiers, but we didn't have 7,000 infantry. Infantry were between 3,200 and 3,006. It came up to 4,002 in the last year of my tenure. However, if you look at the situation, we had one soldier per 100 square kilometer. I don't know the numerics of what miles would be, but it's close to nothing, right? Yep. And so if you have that, how can you protect civilians? Then people will say, in international military terms, well, it's not about that. It's about mobility. Well, the problem is there is no mobility either because you don't have infrastructure to get the troops around. So you have to rely on helicopters that take 20 packs per ride, right? So you just can't move either. So you basically, as I said to the Security Council, we're stuck in the mud. That's what I said, literally, to the council. So we have to. You can't expect us to protect civilians in this situation. So of course, this is also going to hit, any external additional forces coming in. Yep. So these parameters haven't changed. There hasn't been more roads. There hasn't been more airstrips that can carry big aircrafts. There hasn't been, So these issues are going to play into the deployment of the 4,000, let alone the issue of SOFA and respect for freedom of movement. So both those factors are going to play into this. So what is important is not to believe that the RPF is a silver bullet for the situation. It isn't. It's important, but it isn't, and it has to underpin a political process. So that's key for me. I think those are my comments from the floor and from the panel.
So Princeton and
Just
then Brian.
a quick comment on the language question. I agree with. There was a study done just prior to the breakout of the Civil War by the Institute of Political and Security Studies in Addis Ababa that mapped 900 local conflicts underway in South Sudan. This is before over land, over cattle, etc. So you had a lot of localized issues, not language, but land, cattle, ethnic boundaries, etc., that easily were exploited in this current situation.
The ethnic component of conflict in South Sudan is a byproduct of the fallout at the political level. Ethnicity itself is not a cause for conflict. It's a byproduct of the political process. Regarding language, when conflicts start to happen at the local level, and usually it's local grievances against the system. These local grievances are expressed in, of course, the language of the people who are in that locality. So that, for instance, just take where I come from Central Equatoria, around Yei. Recently on YouTube, there are the people there. The youth are mobilized and have picked up arms against the state. Because of so many grievances, mainly the high-handedness of the SPLM in responding to crashing dissent in that area. And how are they expressing their grievances, apart from taking up arms? What's happening is there are songs that are coming out in the local language that are actually insightful and harken back to the days of that community's glory days when they conquered their enemies and stuff like that. So these songs are coming up, and there are certain words in the song that are actually meant to mobilize people. And so that's the role of language here. Going to your question on who can save South Sudan, obviously, as Hilde said, it's the South Sudanese themselves. And the peace agreement provides for every ability to really make South Sudan great if there is political will across the political divide to actually enact it in its full capacity, enact all the terms of the agreement, with all due diligence. That is not happening right now. But again, despite the fact that the peace agreement itself looks like it's dead, none of the parties have given up on it. The SPLM-IO recently, just about a week ago, came out with resolutions after a meeting of the Politburo in Khartoum. And despite saying that they are picking up arms against the state and continuing the armed struggle, they also state emphatically that they are obliged to obey the peace agreement, and they believe that the peace agreement is the way forward. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I'm just going to add two factoids before we go to the next round. The next round will be here in the seventh row, the two next to each other. But let me just mention facts and figures and perspectives on this. South Sudan, as I understand it, it's about 600 or 700 miles tip to tip, maybe roughly the size of Texas, more or less. So you're dealing with 4,000 people, maybe a dozen helicopters probably in the whole UN mission. And just a couple of reference points. The so-called Petraeus criteria for how big a force needs to be to stabilize a population in a robust conflict or in a in an insurgency or any kind of a conflict zone, really. If you go back to the manual that General Petraeus and General Amos and General Mattis wrote in 2006 and 7, that would imply you would need 200,000 infantry or police for 10 million people. And so we're talking about 12,000 versus 200,000. If you don't want to go to the robust U.S. Army standard, but just another point of reference, we all know the New York Police Department, which has a geographically slightly smaller space to worry about, is 36,000 strong to protect 8 million people. So I just thought I'd add those 2 points of reference to back up your point.
I think it would be the equal to protecting 2 airstrips or something in South Sudan, what we had in numbers.
And doesn't even get to Princeton's broader point, which is what about, to the extent you might have to think of some of the local military actors as potentially your adversaries, which the current mission does not contemplate per se. But if you thought in those terms, you'd have yet another demand pushing the force requirements upward. But please.
I'm Rebecca from TechnoServe, and I guess until recently we worked with coffee farmers around Yei to try to diversify the economy. So there is coffee from South Sudan that Nespresso has produced. And again, until recently, we were very hopeful that it would provide an alternate source of income besides oil. I guess my question has to do with the 2 leaders and how capable they would be, even under a functioning peace agreement, to implement it. I mean, they're war criminals, frankly. And I'm curious the extent to which they still have popular support and what the prospects are for replacing them. And would those leaders be any better? Does it matter?
And then, yes.
Yeah, my name is Guillermo Fernandez, and I'm from the political department of the Embassy of Spain. So my question, it goes for Mrs. Johnson. You just mentioned that it was a political conflict that it turned into ethnic conflict, no? So my question is, most of the current ethnic conflicts nowadays, probably, and according to many scholars, originally were also political conflicts that were promoted by its leaders. My question is, you think, are we still in time for, in order to that the leaders can solve that conflict and cannot be out of their hand? I don't know if I'm explaining all right, that even if they want to solve that conflict, and even if the political elites agree in the peace, maybe the population and the groups that they represent, they won't be willing to implement that peace? Thank you very much.
So Hilde, would you like to start the question or the response again, and then we'll go to Princeton and Brian?
Well, on the latter, this is an issue that I'm elaborating a bit in the book, that when the ethnic card is being played, you risk losing control of the situation. So I think, for example, at times during the conflict, clearly, there's been 2 things happening at the same time. One, command and control in the SPLA was always very weak. Command and control in the IO forces was extremely weak. At the same time, as the command and control lines were fragmenting, you had also this groundswell of movement on the ethnic side. And so while you've had clearly use of the ethnic card on the one hand deliberately, this has been revealed both by the AU Commission of Inquiry that none of us really have mentioned but needs to be praised for its very solid work. And it's clear from their assessment as well as from UNMISS, UN human rights investigations, etc., that there has been targeted killings that have been instructed. At the same time, you also have this factor where the command and control is so weak that revenge acts all by themselves are happening simultaneously. Now, is it a situation where we have reached the stage where you can't roll it back? I mean, that's what I'm understanding from your question. It's a tricky question to answer, and it's difficult really to know to which extent you can roll it back. But I tend to believe it is still possible. But if it gets to continue further, I think I said in my statement, it's getting soon to a stage of irreversibility. So I think there's still time to turn it around, but it's going to be very hard. and very significant efforts have to be made of, if then peace is there, of reconciliation, of truth and reconciliation commission, of intercommunal, reconciliation processes. There are many established ways of doing this, and of course, use of hybrid court, because if you don't hold those in charge or responsible for the biggest atrocities to account, then people will not believe in peace. So it's a combination of a number of actions that have to take place for, I think, the ethnic card to come more under control, if I can use that term, for ethnicity not to be out of control. Now, these intercommunal acts, truth and reconciliation processes, and impunity, lack of impunity, and the actions of getting the hybrid court established, investigations underway, getting to hold people to account. These are long processes. So I think somehow there needs to be political actions that are taken first, showing, if the leadership doesn't show that they can reconcile, why would soldiers and normal, citizens be willing to do it? I mean, if the leaders show that they are in continuous conflict on ethnic and political grounds, there is no way you're going to convince people to reconcile. So the political steps have to be taken first, and these processes have to be put in motion. Then I think it is possible to turn things around, but it will take a long time. This is a generational effort. To heal this country will take, a generation or two from what has happened. So it's a real long process. But I think it is still possible. But we're closing to the moment where we can see that it might be irreversible, which is, my nightmare. I mean, there's already lots of nightmares there, but that's really my nightmare. As to the question, I think I answered the question on Kir Mashar in my statement, meaning that there should be, you can't exclude the signatories of the peace agreement from being part of a process of establishing a caretaker government. Now, what that looks like is not in my court. That I would leave to the South Sudanese themselves.
Brian, and then Princeton.
Yeah, is it possible to roll back the ethnic component of the conflict? I think we have a very small window at the moment before South Sudan goes over the cliff and degenerates into a full-scale Rwanda-like scenario. And the way to do that right now is really to get the leaders to adhere to the terms of the peace agreement and put the country back on a peace footing. The longer there is a delay in implementing the peace agreement, the more localized grievances arise, and the more the ethnic component becomes bigger, and we would be sitting in a situation where Rwanda is possible. There has been a precedent of one-on-one inter-community talks to reconcile in 1999 between the Dinka and the Nuer. That happened and bridged the gap between both communities. And I think that as we even embark on implementing the peace agreement and instituting the hybrid court called for in the peace agreement, it's still very critical that some form of reconciliation that adheres to the cultural norms and practices of the people of South Sudan are carried out at the grassroots level to complement what's happening at the top. But that also implies that the leaders at the top should actually reconcile first to set the example. Do the leaders of the two leaders, Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, have popular support? Because the grievances are now taking on an ethnic component, you'll find that there are bases of support for both individuals. And let's not forget, this is a kleptocratic system where a large patronage system has been weaved, and the beneficiaries of the patronage system form the support base for the president and for the vice president, and the support bases can be found in all parts of the country. It's not just restricted to particular points, particular locations where these two leaders come, although the locations where they come from form the majority of the base, but that support can be found nationwide.
Thank you. Princeton.
Well, look, I think these questions go back to the question of this gentleman here about who can save South Sudan. And the international community is involved and has a responsibility. All the neighboring countries are involved, and many of them in a negative way. Uganda and Sudan were fighting a proxy war in South Sudan in the first year. South Sudan now has Riek Machar in Khartoum and is hosting the opposition playing the game. Uganda in and out of support for Kiir. Arms sales from all sides, financial dealings from all sides. So you can't separate the responsibility of the South Sudanese from the international community, including the neighbors. Therefore, to get at this question of how you would move forward, you do need, and particularly the neighbors, to say, we are going to take responsibility for bringing this process and this deterioration to a stop. Can you stop it? Can you arrest it in time? I agree with Brian, it's a very small window. But you could cut off all the arms and all the financial support coming from abroad. That'd be a very good step to start with. Second, I have little faith that Salva Kiir and Riek Machar will themselves carry out a transformation. What you need is a process that allows them to exit the scene. And that means you have, side by side with a strong oversight, the hybrid court. And in effect, you say to the leaders, you can either go along with the transformation or there's the court across the street. And your chances of amnesty and immunity rest with what you do in the peace process. So there are ways to bring them in and find a graceful exit for them as you move forward. This takes a lot of work and effort, but it can be done, and it needs to be done soon.
I think we have time for one more round of questions. I have a lot of hands, so I think what we're going to have to do is consider this to be the lightning round. and what I mean by that is, first of all, our panelists will have to take very good notes, because there are going to be about 5 or 6 questions on the table by the time we get back to them. And they're not going to each one respond to each of your questions. And also, please, just one question per person. So with those rules, let's go ahead and see if we can start at the front and work back up here in the second row, please. We'll do 5 or 6, so please be ready.
Hi, Karen Zeitvogel. I worked on a radio program about South Sudan for many years, including when Ms. Johnson announced that she was leaving. At the time, you were accused of cozying up to the government and also of cozying up to Riek Machar.
Or more the latter at that time, I think.
And I wanted to get to hear from you about the accusations against you and against UNMISS in general, and whether we should, instead of blaming UNMISS, the South Sudanese seem to have a talent for blaming everything on somebody else. Should they not be looking, I think you've all addressed this, but looking more in their own backyard to fix things?
And then here in the 4th row.
Thank you. I'm Laura Bosco. I'm with American University. And I just wanted to first say I completely agree that the political solution is what's needed, led by South Sudanese, but we're talking about a medium or long-term game, and there's lives on the stake today and tomorrow. I was wondering if you guys, what are the best practices? What can specifically UNMISS do today, tomorrow, this week, to help to do as much as it can to have as great of an impact specifically towards protection in that interim? Thank you.
Great question. And then we'll go to the back. A woman on the aisle right there in the white blouse, please.
Great. Hi, I'm Katie Campo from the National Endowment for Democracy. Given that the U.S.-South Sudan bilateral relationship has grown more tense, and as Ambassador Lyman pointed out, all the regional players have some skin in the game as well, I'm wondering your thoughts on how diplomatically China could play a role, and what would that look like, not just in South Sudan where they have lots of interests and where they've lost peacekeepers, but getting the regional players as well to start to play along. Thanks.
See if we can do a couple more. So one row back.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jennifer Cobb. I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit on the growing anti-American sentiment within the government and also within the military that seems to be emerging.
We're just going to do 2 more with apologies. So right behind you, and then over here, we'll take the last one after that.
Hi, my name is Sherry Baker. I'm currently working as a consultant on human rights and security issues with the Center for Civilians in Conflict and also with the ACOTA program at the Department of State. I am curious to hear what your opinions are on the protection of civilian sites in South Sudan and what are some of the challenges and successes at those sites.
And finally, over against the wall, please. That'll round it out.
Hi, thank you. Ayan Bior with South Sudan in Focus. You said that the agreement should be adjusted. And I'm wondering what parts of the agreement should be adjusted, and does the agreement itself make room for amendments in the first place? I always thought it was set in stone. Thanks.
So, Hilde, would you like to go first or last? It's really
I'll
your...
go last, if
Okay.
I may.
So, Princeton, why don't you start?
Well, let me take some of them, and I'll let Hilde address some of the specific UN ones, although I will say on the first question that I know that Hilde was working extraordinarily behind the scenes to bring parties together as this crisis was unfolding, and that's what good diplomats do. China's role. China has played a partially helpful role in this sense. They keep the oil sector going, and because without them, their oil presence, it wouldn't function at all. They have a infantry brigade in UNMISS. They advocate for the peace process. But the degree to which they would use much greater leverage, let's say, on Khartoum's role is questionable. And we've always had that limitation. They don't like to get involved in detailed politics, but they're staying closer to this peace process than they normally do. And there's good contact between them and the various envoys. Anti-American sentiment, a very serious issue, presence inside the government, outside perhaps too. And we saw it in the attack on the Terrain Hotel, very pointedly anti-American. It grows out of a long history that we've had with the South Sudanese government from its independence, but it's very dangerous in terms of blaming the outsiders. You didn't support us, and that's why we're in this mess. I find it a very dangerous thing. As far as adjustments to the agreement, sure, it can be adjusted. The parties that put the agreement together, IGAD, can bring the parties together and say it has to be amended. And it can be adjusted. It can be adjusted to provide much more oversight from IGAD and the AU and enforcement elements that were not there at the beginning and have not been there since. Without that, I don't see how the agreement's going to work.
Brian, why don't you take one or two, and then we'll let Hilde Mr. Murphy or Mr. Harper back clean up.
Right. Let me touch on the anti-American sentiment that has become so visible in recent weeks. I think the anti-American sentiment is a result of this perception among some of the mobilizers and decision makers in the government that the United States has abandoned them and is taking on a stance that is highly critical of the government. And the support base of the president in particular has taken the view that the Americans are no longer friends. And of course, that is also a buildup of a deterioration that started not now. It started probably a couple of years back when the president came here, and it's described very well in Hilde's book, and everyone who follows South Sudanese issues particularly knows about this fallout when supposedly one of the leaders of South Sudan stood up the president here and the UN Secretary General. So that's the history of the deterioration in relations. I don't think that it is something that's permanent. As soon as there is a change in the decision-making level in terms of, let's say, adhering to the peace agreement, I think that will change. We have seen that the first vice president, when he came over here to the United Nations General Assembly, also took the time to sort of go around and talk to people in the power structure here, basically to try to mitigate any differences or to build bridges. So that act itself is an indication that the anti-American sentiment that is so prevalent right now is a temporary issue that can go away as soon as certain issues at the top level between the government of South Sudan and the American administration are rectified. What parts of the agreement can be adjusted? Certainly, when you look at what has happened, the agreement, the security arrangements of the agreement have collapsed. And in any agreement, as soon as the security arrangements collapse, that means actually there's no peace agreement. And I think that part about the security arrangements need to be revisited. For instance, if at all there's a situation where the deposed vice president ever returns to Juba, under what terms of protection should he have, or should he come back? Should he have his own force, as was stipulated previously? Should someone take over the management of Juba? I mean, those are the issues that need to be addressed. And hopefully also the impending coming of the protection force may contribute to resolving the security challenges that have faced this agreement. What role can China play? I think Princeton answered that quite well, and I'll not delve into that. But I guess the other big question is the perception that Hilde was causing up to parties in the government, and I'll leave her to answer that.
Thank you. Hilde, over to you.
Well, let me start maybe with the first question. I mean, the accusations against me went both ways, as you were saying. Initially, it was that I was cozying up to the government. Then when the crisis started and we protected people in our bases and opened the gates, we were accused of cozying up to the rebels and protecting the rebels and all of that. And I was both transporting landmines, weapons to Riek Machar, and I was his lover at the same time, just for everyone's information.
Gee, wow.
Very interesting.
I didn't know NSRHD had that in the mandate.
Yeah, so exactly. Yeah, you have to just sustain yourself through that. And what I was not concerned about was myself. I mean, my safety was, of course, an issue, as Princeton was saying. So that was certainly a concern. But apart from that, the challenge that was there for me was the fate of the South Sudanese people. That's what I'm worried about, not myself. And that's also what is the center of the book. So I don't give much space or room for elaborating on my own fate. I mean, that's of less interest in my view. I think the only lesson we can draw from that is that there is a tendency to look for scapegoats in all situations like these. Any country going through a conflict will look for scapegoats. It has been the UN, it has been me, UNMISS at certain periods. It's now the US. And what is also certain is that these things go in waves in South Sudan. So everything changes very rapidly. So the sentiment can be one day, it can be turned around and switch entirely the other day. And in 2 days, you have two totally different stories, and people are adjusting. And it's just like this, with lightning speed, which implies that the concerns around, the anti-American sentiments, this can turn around tomorrow or on Monday. And I think what has happened now, probably with Trabandeng's visit to Washington and everything, you have national security and SPLM youth and the Ministry of Information colluding on feeding popular sentiments all the time in Juba and in South Sudan. And they are feeding, these are the demonstrations that are being permitted and promoted, and they are feeding them with all sorts of materials and whatnot. So if they decide that they want to switch the sentiments, it's not going to be the popular sentiments all over the country, but the impression of the sentiments in Juba will change like this. So this is all about politics and how you play the politics and how you play the cards and who you want to blame at this point and who you don't want to blame the next day. This is entirely related to the power politics of government. And so I think you can be quite at ease on this. This will change with changing times. So the issue is, in my view, less about the sentiments of that are partly produced and reproduced by power politics. The issue is, what are we going to do to get this country out of the mess, and how can we assist the South Sudanese in making that happen? That's, for me, the big issue. If I can then move to the other question here, was related to the immediate actions that one should take, short, medium term. What can UNMISS do? UNMISS can do very little at this point in time on the political side. And the reason is they are in a very tight spot in Juba at this point in time. The political process was driven by IGAD. The political process was supported by an envoy of the Special Secretary General, exactly for this reason. Now it's Fink Haysom who has this position. And that is because the mission is in a tight spot where it is. And so the issue now is, what can be done to get a process underway in which we are rescuing the peace agreement. And I don't want to be interpreted as saying this is what has to happen, and not be misunderstood in any way as this is falling apart. It can be rescued, but it can only be rescued if there are some adjustments. And I think the obvious ones are the security arrangements. The facts have changed on the ground. If you're going to have forces into cantonments, whose forces? From where? Under whose control are they? Remember, just these issues are different and need to be accounted for. Similarly, what is the role of the RPF, the Regional Protection Force? How does that link with the security arrangements? There are many, many questions, but it's absolutely possible to sort these out. But as I said, the security arrangements will always be a consequence of the political part of an agreement. And that's where, one has to look at what can be done to have the signatories of the agreement around one table. Because my fear is that excluding key players here is going to produce new spoilers, and new powerful spoilers. And I think Princeton was the one mentioning, but I also want to highlight the role of Khartoum here. They have 4 or 5 now of the key opposition leaders. They can arm them, and I presume they're doing so anytime. And this has a huge impact on the security situation in South Sudan. In the book, there's a chapter called Neighbors, Peacemakers, or Spoilers. And that's related to this issue. It clearly has to be handled in a comprehensive way by the region. And you have to see them be part of a solution for South Sudan. You can't de-link them, as I think Princeton was also saying. Just one question before I end. The POCs, I was asked by someone on the challenges and successes.
You want to say what the POCs are?
Yeah, the protection of civilian sites where actually, when we opened our gates, we couldn't have a situation that was without control internally in the bases. We needed to fence off areas which we call the protection of civilian sites. That was where the IDPs were, the displaced. The civilians were protected in those sites. After a couple of weeks, the arrangements were put in place in which the humanitarians were running those sites to distinguish clearly between the military side of the mission and the humanitarian operations. And I have to say, for those who are following humanitarian stuff, I was deeply involved in that in UNICEF. It was quite a revolution that both the ICRC and Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders, are both operating within military bases in UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan. That has never happened before. I doubt it will ever happen anywhere else, but we'll see. But it's really, this situation of saving people's lives pulled all, good forces together, where people were willing to actually reconsider some of their principles to be able to save lives. Otherwise, they wouldn't have survived. So these POC sites, of course, people are living under very difficult conditions because they're totally crammed and packed, and there are all sorts of efforts made to ease up and assist in the situation. But let me give you 3 important things that I think have to happen. You will never be able to have people move home and return to their homes if there isn't a credible peace. If they don't believe that the peace is going to hold, they will never go home. That's number one. So political solution, again, is the main way forward. Number two, you need to give people a credible feeling of protection. So there's three P's. So peace, protection, meaning that there has to be some control of the security forces because they are the ones that people are the most afraid of. So even if there is peace, there needs to be some protection and protective efforts to protect them. If they don't see that, they are not going to move back to their neighborhoods and their homesteads. Number three, police. You need to find a way of training new police forces that can work with UNMISS, and here UNMISS can have a huge opportunity and huge responsibility of being present and help build a new police force that is respectful of human rights and that is credible to people, with presence of UN police on the ground in the field. I think that's absolutely critical for them to be willing to come back. And I think that's the solution, actually short and medium term, for the POCs. Otherwise, it's just to operate them as best as you can, improving conditions, making sure that people are at least not, living in the mud in the way they are, trying to expand the areas, etc., until you have achieved a sustainable peace. So I think that's my response on that. I think just finally, my hope is that a rescue operation is a collective effort where both the international community, the Troika, but not least the region, is really pushing for a political way forward here, where the signatories are involved. And without it, I'm very, very worried about where South Sudan is heading. And so I think it's possible to do that, but we need courageous leadership. I think the region holds the key to a large extent to this. And that, I think, is my final word.
Well, on behalf of the Africa Security Initiative at Brookings, I just want to thank all three of these amazing panelists for their service to their country, as well as for what they've done today, and Hilde for her fantastic book. I think she's going to stay to sign books, and if you want to buy one, that would be great. Christmas is coming, and this may not be the most natural Christmas read, but maybe by then we can start to energize a new
We can hope for the
effort.
new year.
A new hope for the new year.
Dawn.
So please join me. Thanks to all of you as well, but please join me in thanking them.